In Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues for his account of what happiness is. He argues that happiness is rational activity in accordance with virtue. That's Aristotle's answer to this vexing question, if you will. It's this hard question, this question that people have been wrong about, but that it's very important to be right about. Happiness, the highest good, the thing that we should be aiming at as we live our lives, is rational activity in accordance with virtue. Acting virtuously, in other words. To live a good life is to act virtuously. That's in Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Inasmuch as that is his answer as to what happiness is and what the highest good is, Book 1, Chapter 7, and the function argument in particular, which is in Book 1, Chapter 7, is the heart of his ethical theory and the heart of his ethical project. The rest of the ethics is simply filling in the details. One of the things that Aristotle notes almost immediately after concluding that happiness is rational activity with virtue, he notes that what he's given us is a sketch. It's an outline of the human good. What does that mean? Well, take that claim. Happiness is rational activity in accordance with virtue. What exactly does that mean? If that's all I knew about the highest good or happiness, how am I supposed to go about changing my life? What should I be aiming at exactly? That claim is so kind of sketchy or lacks kind of specific content. It's so sketchy that it's hard for it to be action guiding. It's hard for me to see what I should do or not do in light of that claim. The rest of the ethics attempts to fill in the details, attempts to fill in the outline. We're not reading all the rest of the ethics, but I'm going to give you a kind of sense of how the rest of the ethics does that. So books 2 through 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics are concerned, 2 through 6, I should say, are concerned with what the virtues are and what the rational activities that they govern are. So you see that claim, happiness is rational activity in accordance with virtue. Two questions you might have about it. What on earth are the rational activities at issue here? Could you be a little bit more specific, Aristotle? And the second question would be, well, what are the virtues? Could you be more specific about that? And Aristotle would say, well, yes, of course. Read books 2 through 6. We're not reading all of books 2 through 6. We've got this snippet from book 2, chapter 7. And I'm going to explain to you how what we read there fills in these details. What it does is it fills in some of the details as to what the rational activities are and what the virtues are that go along with them. And so I'm going to come up with I'm going to make a table here where we list rational activities, and then we're going to list the virtues that go along with those rational activities. So one of the rational activities that Aristotle discusses is fear and confidence. That's what he calls it. So feeling fear, for example, is a rational activity, according to Aristotle. It's an activity that involves or requires reason, right? Because it involves or requires concepts. So feeling fear is a rational activity. But what Aristotle notes in book 2 is that, well, you can feel fear inappropriately. You can be too fearful, or you can be not fearful enough. And so what's really important is to feel fear the right way. Well, how do we do that? You need a virtue to do that. You need courage. Courage is a virtue. It's a state of character that disposes us to feel fear in the right way, to not be too afraid, to not be too little afraid, but to feel the appropriate degree of fear. That's what courage does. And likewise with confidence. I could have said all this same thing about confidence. So courage is the virtue that governs the rational activity of feeling fear and confidence. We find him saying something like that in book 2, chapter 7. Okay. Well, with that information, we can flesh out this outline account of happiness, rational activity in accordance with virtue. We can flesh it out a little bit more now. We now know, given that courage is a virtue and that the rational activity that it governs is feeling fear and confidence, we now know that happiness is, in part, feeling fear courageously. What is it to live a good life, according to Aristotle? It is, in part, to feel fear and confidence courageously. To not do it excessively, to not do it deficiently, right? To not feel too much fear, and then you'd be a coward. To not feel too little fear, then you'd be rash. You'd be kind of foolhardy, right? But to feel fear appropriately. Happiness, living a good life, the human good, just is in part feeling fear courageously. Another example. Aristotle talks about pleasures that we might experience, and in particular, he focuses on pleasures of touch. And in his view, pleasures of touch refers to the pleasures of food, drink, and sex. Those are all pleasures of touch, okay? That's a kind of rational activity, according to Aristotle. It involves or requires reason. There is a virtue that goes along with that kind of activity. He calls it temperance. If you go overboard with regard to these feelings of pleasure and these pleasures of touch, right? You drink too much, you eat too much, you engage in sex too much, or you pursue these things too much, right? That's a kind of self-indulgence, according to Aristotle. You want to pursue these pleasures in the appropriate way and to the appropriate degree. Temperance, or as it might be called, self-control or moderation, is the virtue that disposes us to do that, to feel these pleasures, to pursue them appropriately. And so happiness, living a good life, just is in part feeling these pleasures temperately or moderately in accordance with moderation. That just is in part what it is to live a good life. Another example he uses, using money. That's a rational activity. It involves or requires concepts. Lions can't use money. Plants can't use money, right? Okay. What's the virtue that goes along with it? Sometimes it's translated, I think our translation calls it liberality, but I think a better translation for certain reasons is generosity. Using your money generously, that is a rational activity that's in accord with virtue. So happiness, living a good life, just is in part using your money generously. That's Aristotle's idea. And he goes on and on. There are a bunch of these virtues, right? I've listed them all there for you. I'm not going to go through them in detail. But what he would say is that to live a good life is to exercise those virtues. That's what it is to live a good life. And in books 2 through 6, what Aristotle does is he gives detailed accounts of each of these virtues. He goes through describing what they look like, describing what they dispose you to do. He also talks about the vices. So I mentioned one earlier, cowardice is a vice. It's a disposition to feel too much fear. We want to avoid the vices, and we want to acquire the virtues so that we can live good lives. One interesting facet of Aristotle's account, take using money generously. That is in part what it is to live a good life. Okay. Well, that means that you need a little bit of money in order to live a good life, right? You can't use your money generously unless you have some money. If you don't have any money, you can't use it, right? And so Aristotle actually argues despite what you might think, given some earlier things he said, that no, you need money in order to be happy, in order to live a good life. And you need some pleasure. You need to feel some of these pleasures in order to live a good life and be happy. Because happiness and living a good life consists in part in using money generously, feeling pleasures moderately. And so, despite the fact that he argues that pleasure and wealth are not the highest good, that doesn't mean he's just against pleasure and against wealth. He's just arguing they're not the highest good. They're not the end all and be all of life. That's not what's going to, getting as many pleasures or as much wealth as possible is not what's going to make your life go well. Sure, you need some pleasure, you need some money, but they're not what makes your life good. Rational activity in accordance with virtue is. And rational activity in accordance with virtue might involve pleasures and might involve money. That's Aristotle's view.